Welcome to the third in a series of presentations on the Australian R&D Tax Incentive. Welcome back. My name's Stuart Hazel, and in this presentation we're going to be discussing the planning and execution of your R&D project and the nature and importance of record keeping. As in all the presentations in this series, I have used my best endeavours to provide accurate and up-to-date information. However, you should be aware that rules and regulations do change over time, and you should consult business.gov.au for updated information on the R&D tax incentive. I want to start this presentation by talking more generally about the nature of research and development within a commercial environment. Before embarking on an R&D project in a commercial environment, it's important to understand the strategic market objective the company is addressing and why it is important to make this investment. It's also important to review the risk and rewards for undertaking this R&D and understand the potential return on investment. For a number of reasons, it's important to understand the prior art and the existing IP landscape, because you may be infringing on other people's intellectual property if you don't have a good understanding of the background IP with respect to the project you're embarking on. Having addressed these three principles, the next is to get the basics right. Your project should be planned and budgeted with a targeted outcome. You should be recruiting the right people with the right skills to support the project and ensuring they have the right tools to enable them to complete the work. Attention to detail is important, and effective record keeping enables you to both capture and control the intellectual property you are generating, as well as go back and look at what people have done in situations where, for example, you need to troubleshoot elements that have not gone well. With respect to the R&D tax incentive, the records they are seeking do address best practice, and thus by complying with the rules under the R&D tax incentive, there are distinct advantages for your business. In an ideal world, whilst industry would like to see that you have developed a plan and budgeted for the project, and that as you move through the project you plan, execute, review the outcomes, adjust your plans and continue through a systematic process, reaching a conclusion at the end of the project. Because these sorts of projects are risky, the conclusion may not be a satisfactory outcome, but that does not negate the benefit of the R&D tax incentive. Indeed, it is because of the risk of failure and the cost to the company of such failure that the government has introduced the R&D tax incentive, because they're looking for investment by companies in bona fide R&D activities. So let's look closer at the importance of appropriate record keeping, both from a business perspective and with respect to the R&D tax incentive. So why keep good records? Well, clearly capturing and protecting your intellectual property is a bonus. It builds a defence against loss or theft of your IP, or where you may wish to litigate against a company infringing upon your intellectual property. Good records can also show you the cost of your R&D and the return on investment. Indeed, as you undertake further projects, you develop a good handle on the investment required to achieve a specific outcome. That is, you start to build a history of your R&D activities over time. And of course, good records are important to comply with the R&D tax incentive. From the perspective of Aus Industry, the types of questions they will ask of you are your R&D records able to show that the project is planned and aimed at achieving new and novel findings? Do you have records to show your project is based on original and non-obvious concepts? Can you demonstrate that the project involves uncertainty with respect to the final outcome? That is, there is technical risk. Do your records show that the work is planned and budgeted and will be undertaken in a systematic manner? Can your records demonstrate that the results are not random? That is, the outcomes are reproducible. And finally, and importantly, are your records contemporaneous? That is, are the records made at the time that the work and activities within the project are undertaken? As I said previously, the records you are keeping should not overly add to the burden of the business, because it is good practice to keep such records, and as case history within the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal has shown, records kept at an appropriate industry standard are acceptable. AUS Industry and the ATO do impose some additional requirements that may not be standard practice within your business. They will expect you to be able to explain the relationship between R&D activities and the amount of expenditure incurred with respect to that activity. That is, for each core and supporting activity, you should be able to show how costs have been apportioned to each. This is critical to demonstrating the relationship between the eligible R&D activities and the eligible expenditure. This is shown schematically here, where you have records to show the research project was carried out, that it was systematically conducted and well documented, and that there is a link between these activities and the company's chart of accounts. So let's now have a look more specifically at some of the records you should be keeping. The first I start with is the process for approval of the project. It is ideal that you have some record of an approved budget and approved project outline as signed off by, for example, the R&D committee, the board of the company, or the CEO or managing director. This is part of the record keeping to show that the project was planned and budgeted. The next step is to look at the state of the art prior to commencing R&D. A prior art assessment is both valuable to the company as well as facilitating compliance with the R&D tax incentive. A prior art assessment may include a description of the new knowledge being sought, documentary evidence that the knowledge was not in the public domain can be gained through a number of processes: a review of contemporary literature, patent searches, documented expert opinions, or other material. The following schematic provides an overview of the type of inputs and outputs with respect to a prior art assessment. These include inputs such as patent searches, expert opinion, review of technical reports, and market research. Now, I use the term market research advisedly. What I am meaning here is a technical review of the market for the current state of the art, not market research undertaken for the purpose of ascertaining price or acceptability of a new product into the market. As such, market research is not eligible under the R&D tax incentive. Having gathered inputs, a formal prior art report is valuable. This documents the state of the art, the knowledge gaps that exist, and the opportunities for new knowledge that will be of value to the company undertaking the R&D project. Thus, as well as being held on file should AusIndustry or the ATO ask for it, this report can really assist the research and development team in focusing their efforts and not reinventing the wheel. As the technical elements of the project commence, you should have within your records details of the experiments undertaken within the core activities and the protocols to demonstrate that the work is systematic. For example, have you documented your hypothesis? And remember, don't be scared of the term hypothesis. It is simply documentation of the idea, concept or theory that you are testing as you develop the new product or process. Document the experimental protocols that are being undertaken to test the hypothesis, idea or concept. And again, the term experiment applies to the appropriate technology relevant to the industry area in which your business operates. Of course, you should be recording the results and analysis of those results as part of your ongoing R&D project. Indeed, one could ask, why would a company undertake an R&D project if it wasn't going to collect the results and analyse those results with a view to launching a new product or process? As we have discussed previously, there will be supporting activities underpinning the core activities. And again, it is important to understand how these supporting activities are either directly related to the core R&D or are for the dominant purpose of supporting that core R&D. Research and development projects vary. Some have a heavy emphasis on the core activities, and that is their major area of expenditure. Others have a heavy emphasis on supporting activities, with the core activity being the culmination of a significant amount of preparation work. Notwithstanding, both core and supporting activities should be well documented in the company records. To try and make that a little clearer, let me present this simple schematic to help you navigate your way through the record-keeping pathway. We start at the top right box with a documented prior art review and assessment. This informs the development of the concept or hypothesis. Having done that, experimental planning can be undertaken with a review of the methods needed to test the hypothesis. All three should be documented. Once this background work has been completed, we move into the experimental phase where we are documenting supporting and core activities, remembering that supporting activities underpin the work undertaken within a core activity. As each project progresses, results are collected, evaluated, and appropriate actions determined. This can include anything from progressing to the next stage, reviewing and going back to an earlier stage to address errors or unexpected results, through to decisions to abandon the project. Depending upon the complexity of the activities, an interim report may be useful, where, for example, there are different sections being undertaken by different groups. So there might be a material science group, there may be an electronics group, there may be a chemistry group, all working on the same project. And interim reports can draw this information together for review by the entire team. This may identify additional research that needs to be undertaken, or indeed identify new opportunities for further R&D. All going well, this work may culminate in a final report and, in an ideal world, release of the product to production based on the nature of the findings. When looking at the linkage between your R&D activities and your financial records, One way to keep track of these effectively is to have a dedicated project number that can link between your research records and the chart of accounts. As I mentioned previously, the ATO expects that each individual activity will have costs directly associated with each. If this raises any concerns with you, it is advisable to discuss with your registered tax agent. So let me put this all together in a more detailed schematic. Within your records, it is important that you record the start date and the end date for R&D activities. The end date can be an estimate where it is projected to have a future end period, and I note that start and end dates are part of the expected record you should maintain. We then have the record of the actual activities being undertaken in the project. That is, the details of each supporting and core activity. Linking the R&D activity to the chart of accounts, you can claim a range of directly related expenditure, valid overhead costs, valid direct input costs, labour costs, material costs, external input costs and others. But note, the R&D activities are linked to the chart of accounts via this record. Thus, if your records can address this schematic, you are well positioned back to the R&D tax incentive. This brings us to the end of this particular presentation. In the next presentation, we'll be discussing compliance and integrity. In that presentation, I aim to give you an overview of the activities of AusIndustry and the ATO with respect to their compliance and integrity activities, as well as perspective on the government's view on this matter. If you have any questions or comments of a general nature, please feel free to email at the address shown, and if this series has been of interest to you, please subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below.